On Friday, January 10th, 2003, 85-year-old Anna Mae Branson was standing in her bedroom closet on the second floor of her large home in Madisonville, Kentucky. Madisonville was a peaceful coal mining town that residents had nicknamed the best town on earth. Anna Mae was trying to pick out the perfect outfit to wear to a dance that she was going to the following night with her new fiancé, and she eyed a long black cape with a leopard print collar hanging in the closet, and she smiled. Anna Mae loved clothes, and at 85 years old, she still enjoyed getting all dressed up. So almost every time she left the house, she wore high heels, a huge sparkling diamond ring, and a perfectly styled wig. In fact, Anna Mae had built a reputation in town for dressing like a movie star for decades, and she wasn't about to give that up now just because some people saw her as an old lady. But Anna Mae had not always worn fancy clothes and expensive diamonds. She was born in Madisonville in 1917, the oldest of 5 siblings, and she had a pretty traditional upbringing that involved going to church regularly and helping her parents look after her younger siblings. And most people in town had made their living from working in the Kentucky coal mines or from running farms. But as Anna Mae grew up, she had discovered she was great with numbers and with money. And so at a time when there weren't a lot of career opportunities for women, she had dreamed of starting her own business someday. So after she had graduated high school and gotten married, she and her husband worked several different jobs and put away as much money as they could for the future. And then in 1950, when they'd saved up enough, they bought a Dairy Queen franchise and then opened the first fast food restaurant in Madisonville. And it turned out Madisonville loved Dairy Queen. And soon, Anna Mae and her husband's restaurant was the busiest place in town, and they were bringing in more money than they had ever imagined. Anna Mae and her husband had run the Dairy Queen successfully for 40 years, and over that long period of time, they had become 2 of the most well-known and beloved people in all of Madisonville. But then, in 1994, Anna Mae's husband passed away, and she didn't want to run the restaurant without him, so she had sold the Dairy Queen and walked away a millionaire. At the time, most of her family had assumed Anna Mae would retire, but she loved working and feeling like she was part of the community, so she had taken a chunk of the money she'd made from selling the Dairy Queen and invested it in rental homes and other real estate properties in the area. And so by now, she had been running her own real estate business for almost 10 years and had made a ton more money in the process. And she had no intention of retiring anytime soon. Back in the closet, Anna Mae walked over to the shelves that held her large shoe collection. But before she could decide which pair of high heels she should wear to the following night's dance, she heard the phone ring in the bedroom. So she stepped out of the closet, walked across her room, and grabbed the phone on the bedside table. And right away, as she listened to the voice on the other line, a very concerned look came across her face. There was a man yelling at her on the other line, and Anna Mae could not figure out what he was even saying. She asked the man to calm down and to please speak lower, but the man shouted that Anna Mae needed to come to his house as soon as she could. And Anna Mae finally recognized the voice. It was Robert Prince, a man who rented a house from her. So she asked Robert, what's wrong? What's going on here? How can I help? Then Robert got really quiet, and in almost a whisper, he said there were ghosts in his attic, and that Anna Mae had to come get the ghosts out of there. Then Robert hung up on the other line, and Anna Mae stood there in her bedroom with a stunned look on her face. She hung up the phone and sat down on her bed. Robert had always been a little weird and eccentric since he'd moved into one of her properties, but saying he saw ghosts in the attic was strange, even for him, and Anna Mae didn't know how to handle it. She worried if she called the police about this, Robert might get in some kind of trouble, and she didn't want that. So she decided she would call to check in on him over the weekend and then maybe pay him a visit on Monday if she needed to. Anna Mae took a deep breath and collected herself, but then a sudden knock at the front door startled her. And she laughed because she wondered if maybe one of her other renters was also coming to tell her that they had ghosts in their house too. So Anna Mae got up and headed downstairs, and when she opened the front door, a grin came across her face. Because it was not a renter scared of ghosts, it was her nephew, Russell Winstead. Russell smiled and gave his aunt a big hug. He was 37 years old, 6 foot 1 inches tall, and his brown hair was just starting to turn a little gray. Anna Mae's younger brothers and sisters all had children, so Anna Mae had a bunch of nieces and nephews, and all of those nieces and nephews said Anna Mae was like a second mom to them. And so, as Anna Mae had gotten older, the ones who still lived in Madisonville made it a point to stop by regularly to check on her and to make sure she wasn't alone too often in her big house. Anna Mae and Russell walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. And right away, Russell asked her how the real estate business was going. And Anna Mae just laughed and then told him about how Robert Prince, one of her renters, had actually just called and said there were ghosts in his attic, and so that was basically how the real estate business was going. But while Anna Mae laughed, Russell didn't. He did not think it was funny at all. He said it sounded like the guy was seriously disturbed, and he told Anna Mae not to go over to the house to see Robert by herself. He said if she really needed to see him, she should call him, Russell, or his dad, who was Anna Mae's youngest brother, and they would go with her. Anna Mae thanked Russell, but told him that really everything was fine, Robert Prince was harmless, and then she quickly changed the subject and asked how things were going with him. Russell filled her in on what his wife and kids were up to and said they'd all see her at church on Sunday night, and then he also talked a little bit about how his work as a mining engineer was going. And then, after they talked a little while longer, Russell said he better get home for dinner, so he stood up, gave his aunt another big hug, and walked out. Once Russell was gone, Anna Mae headed back upstairs into her closet to settle on an outfit for the big dance she was going to the next day. And then, later that night, as she got ready for bed, she thought again about that phone call from Robert, and suddenly it really wasn't funny to her. Much like Russell, she did think that, maybe something was wrong with Robert. Maybe he really was disturbed, and that she needed to be really careful with him and not be alone with him. But by the following night, Saturday night, Anna Mae had put Robert and the ghosts in his attic out of her mind because she was having the best time she'd had in months, dancing with her new fiancé in an outfit that made her look like a movie star. The next day, on Sunday, January 12th, so 2 days after Anna Mae got that call about ghosts from Robert Prince, she was attending evening services at the church that was right across the street from her house. And at around 7 p.m., the service ended, and Anna Mae went to the lobby to say hi to some of her friends. And as she was there, her nephew Russell, who had visited her a couple days earlier, along with his wife and their kids, came over to talk to her for a bit. A little while later, Anna Mae said goodnight to everyone, stepped outside, and walked across the street to her house. She was wearing a sweater, her diamond ring, and one of her capes. When she got home, Anna Mae walked through the living room and back to the kitchen. She took off her cape and draped it over a kitchen chair. Then she made herself some soup and sat down to eat. But at 7:15 p.m., a few minutes after she'd begun eating, there was a loud knock at the front door. Now, visitors often stopped by to see Anna Mae after church, so she didn't think anything out of the ordinary was going on. So she walked to the front of the house, she opened the door, smiled, and said hello to the visitor standing there. Then the visitor stepped inside, but Anna Mae didn't notice that they were hiding something behind their back. The visitor then took a deep breath and then told Anna Mae that they really needed her help, big time. But after hearing what they wanted, Anna Mae shook her head and said she would not do what the visitor was asking her to do. And then suddenly the visitor's face turned red and they started shouting at Anna Mae. A look of fear crossed Anna Mae's face and she took a few steps back, but the visitor moved in closer to her, shouting even louder and showing her what they had hiding behind their back. It was a 2-foot, 1/2-inch metal breaker bar, which is like a large socket wrench used to tighten or loosen rusted bolts. The visitor held the breaker bar above their head, and Anna Mae screamed. She held up her hands and tried to get the visitor to calm down, but they just kept on shouting. So Anna Mae finally turned around and moved as fast as she could through the living room, and then she rushed down a long hallway to a door that led into the basement. Anna Mae reached out, and the doorknob rattled in her shaking hands, but she flung the door open, slammed it behind her, and started down the stairs into the basement away from this person. But when she reached the bottom, she heard the door to the basement open again, and she turned back, looked up the stairs, and saw standing there was this person, breaker bar in hand over their head, and a second later they were charging down the stairs after her. At around 11:30 a.m. on the following morning, Anna Mae's new fiancé stepped out of his car and walked up to the front door of Anna Mae's house. He was there to pick her up for a lunch date they had planned. Anna Mae's fiancé was a retired doctor in his late 80s, and he never thought he would get married again so late in life. But when he had met Anna Mae, he'd fallen in love with her right away, and so he decided he wanted to spend whatever time he had left with her, and he had proposed, and Anna Mae had said yes. The fiancé knocked on the door and waited, but Anna Mae didn't answer, so he knocked again, and then he rang the doorbell. But still, there was nothing. So he leaned in close to the door to try to hear if there was any movement inside, but the house was quiet. And when a couple more minutes had passed with still no Anna Mae, he really started to worry. So he walked away from the house and went across the street to the church. He walked into the church lobby and stepped into a small office where a woman was sitting behind a desk, and he said he was worried something was wrong with Anna Mae, and he asked the woman to call 911 and then to please call Anna Mae's brother, Earl. The woman knew Anna Mae and her family very well, and she said she would take care of it. The fiancé thanked her, and then quickly he rushed out of the church and walked back across the street to Anna Mae's house. And in a matter of minutes, an officer from the Madisonville Police Department and Anna Mae's brother, Earl, pulled up in front of the house. Earl and the officer stepped out of their cars and headed towards the front door. Earl was 67 years old, 18 years younger than his sister, and like his son Russell, he had made it a habit to check on Anna Mae whenever he could. Earl said hello to the officer and the fiancé, and then walked right to a small bush by the porch. He crouched down and grabbed the spare key he knew Anna Mae kept hidden under that bush. Then, with the key, he unlocked the door and let the officer and Anna Mae's fiancé inside. Once inside, all three men started calling out for Anna Mae, but they got no response, so they split up. The officer headed upstairs, the fiancé went to the kitchen, and Earl walked through the living room. They were all concerned Anna Mae had possibly fallen and maybe been knocked unconscious, and Earl was worried that the fall could have taken place sometime the night before, and so she might have been out cold or injured for a long time. Earl called out for his sister again, but he still didn't get a response. So he walked down the hall to the basement door. Then he opened the door, turned on the light, and walked down the stairs. But when he got halfway down the stairs and looked at the floor below him, he screamed. Earl shook his head and he hoped that what he was looking at was some kind of nightmare or hallucination, but it was real, and he couldn't believe it. Anna Mae's body was lying on a rug on the basement floor. She was covered in blood, and her sweater and the shirt she'd been wearing under it were torn to shreds. Earl didn't know what had happened, but he knew this was not the result of a fall. Earl rushed down the rest of the stairs and stood over his sister's broken body. Tears started running down his cheeks, and he felt like he'd gotten the wind knocked out of him. Anna Mae had been about 18 when Earl was born, and she had always been protective of her youngest brother. And even when Earl was an adult with children of his own, Anna Mae had always looked out for Earl's family and helped them in any way she could. In the basement, Earl heard footsteps on the stairs. He looked up and saw Anna Mae's fiancé and the police officer, and when the fiancé saw Anna Mae on the floor, he broke down in tears just like Earl. But the police officer just stood there in shock. It had been 20 years since the last major homicide case had happened in Madisonville, and that was a long time before he, and a lot of people on Madisonville's small police force, had started their careers in law enforcement. The officer quickly called into the police station for backup, and he contacted the county sheriff's department. But he was pretty sure that even the county officers had not seen anything like this before. A few minutes after the call went out to the police and the sheriff's departments, Officer Kelly Rager of the Madisonville Police parked her cruiser in front of Anna Mae's house. She stepped outside and right away felt a chill run through her body. Winter temperatures had dropped below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but it wasn't the weather Rager was feeling. She was shaken because she knew the woman who had lived in this large two-story house. Officer Rager's mom and Anna Mae had been friends for years, and like so many people in Madisonville, Rager had looked up to Anna Mae, and she thought Anna Mae was an inspiration to people, and especially to women who wanted to pursue a career that some others thought women had no business doing. Officer Rager walked towards the front door and heard a car screech to a stop behind her. She turned around and saw Detective Scott Troutman from the Hopkins County Sheriff's Department step out of his car and walk towards her. The two young investigators greeted each other and talked briefly. They both knew they were coming to the scene of a homicide. And even though Troutman did not have a personal connection to the victim like Rager did, he knew how well loved Anna Mae and her family were throughout the area. So Troutman understood that this case was going to affect the entire community. The investigators walked into the house together and saw Earl and Anna Mae's fiancé sitting in the living room with the first officer who had arrived on the scene. All three of them looked like they were still in shock. Detective Troutman crossed over to Earl and the fiancé and told them how sorry he was, and then he asked if they wouldn't mind walking him through what had happened earlier that morning. And they both gave him an account of how they'd gotten to the house and how they'd found Anna Mae's body in the basement. Troutman thanked them for their time and told them investigators would follow up with them soon. Then he and Rager headed to the basement. Anna Mae had converted the basement almost into a small apartment. There was a living room with a comfortable couch, a bathroom with a shower in it, a washer and a dryer, and a small refrigerator and freezer. And when the investigators stepped into that basement, they saw Anna Mae lying face down on a rug in front of the couch. But something immediately stood out to both of them. There was a pool of blood around Anna Mae's body, but other than that, the basement looked totally clean. There was no blood spatter on the walls, the floor, or the stairs. The investigators knew they would have to do a thorough search of the basement, but at first glance, it looked like whoever had killed Anna Mae had taken the time to wipe down the entire crime scene. Detective Troutman did a walkthrough of the basement while Officer Rager crouched down on the floor next to Anna Mae's body to look more closely at the wounds. It was hard for her to concentrate because she couldn't understand how any human being could do something like this to a defenseless 85-year-old woman. But she took a deep breath and tried to leave her personal feelings aside and focused on finding evidence. And one of the first things she noticed was that Anna Mae was still wearing her large, expensive diamond ring. To Rager, this all but ruled out the murder being the result of a robbery. Because why would a robber leave behind such an obvious, expensive piece of jewelry? Then Troutman called Rager over to him. He was down on one knee, leaning in close to the small freezer that was pushed up against one of the walls. So Rager stood up and walked away from the body. Then she crouched down too, next to Troutman, and he pointed out 2 streaks of blood on the freezer. The only blood he'd found in the basement other than the blood right around Anna Mae. And Troutman told Rager that he thought there was something interesting about these streaks of blood. The streaks looked entirely different from each other. Troutman was not a blood spatter expert, but his first thought was that the 2 patterns had been made by 2 different weapons. And the idea that the killer took the time to use 2 separate weapons made him think they must have really wanted to inflict as much pain as possible, or that they had had a mental break and had gone into some kind of frenzied attack. And then, not long after the discovery of these unique blood streaks on the freezer, forensics experts from the county arrived, and they confirmed Troutman's hunch. They said 2 weapons had been used in the attack on Anna Mae. And they also confirmed that someone had cleaned the crime scene, but must have just missed the marks on the freezer. And so while the forensics team did a thorough investigation of the basement and the body, Troutman and Rager went outside and interviewed neighbors to find out if anybody had seen anything out of the ordinary that morning or the night before. But the only information they got was that one neighbor thought she might have seen a truck parked in front of Anna Mae's house on Sunday night, but she couldn't remember the make and model of the truck, so by the time the investigators left the scene later that day, they really did not have much to go on. They considered the possibility that Anna Mae's fiancé might have committed the murder because the violence of the attack could indicate a crime of passion. But her fiancé was an old man who was not in the best health, and they had a hard time believing he had the strength to carry out the kind of attack that had taken place in the basement. So they knew they had to start looking for other potential suspects. So later that evening, several hours after the 911 call, investigators met with different members of Anna Mae's family, and several family members said they knew who police needed to talk to. Robert Prince, the man who rented a house from Anna Mae and recently claimed there were ghosts in his attic that Anna Mae was responsible for. With information about Robert Prince coming from Anna Mae's family, investigators focused their attention on him. And as they dug into his past, he quickly became their primary suspect. Police discovered that multiple people had filed assault charges against Robert, and some people who knew him said he had violent tendencies. It also turned out that Robert drove a truck that could fit the description of the truck Anna Mae's neighbor had claimed to have seen outside of her house on the night of the murder. And then investigators got a piece of bizarre news that made Robert look even more guilty. One of Anna Mae's nieces told police that on the afternoon of January 12th, just a few hours before Anna Mae was believed to have been murdered, Robert Prince had come to the niece's house. And when she had opened the door, he was holding a DVD player, and he said he had to sell the DVD player because he needed some fast cash so he could get out of town. The niece was not interested in buying this DVD player, and so she had sent Robert away, and she hadn't really thought much about it. But when she learned he was a suspect in her aunt's murder case, she wished she had said something to the police right after Robert had showed up at her door. So at this point, investigators believed they had more than enough to bring Robert in for questioning and to get a search warrant for his house. Now, the initial search of Robert's house did not turn up any evidence linking him to the murder, but investigators still saw him as their primary suspect. And so, a couple of days after the murder, Robert arrived at the police station for questioning. And from the moment he walked inside, he was on edge. He talked almost nonstop as he followed an officer into a small interrogation room where Detective Troutman was waiting. In the interrogation room, Robert sat down at a wooden table across from Troutman, and right away, Robert's eyes began darting left and right, left and right. Robert had long brown hair and a large, thick beard. But what stood out to Troutman immediately was that Robert's right arm was in a sling. Troutman sat quietly for a minute and watched Robert shifting in his chair and looking over his shoulder. Then Troutman asked Robert if he was right or left-handed, and Robert said he was right-handed. Troutman did not let his face give anything away, but he wondered if maybe Robert had injured his right arm while attacking Anna Mae, and that was why it was in a sling. Then Troutman leaned in and asked Robert about his past assault charges, but Robert got really angry and said he would not talk about any of them. So, in a calm voice, Troutman said that was fine, and he did his best to get Robert to relax. And then he asked Robert to talk about where he had been on the day Anna Mae had been killed. Robert shifted some more in his chair and then started tapping his left hand on the table. Troutman just kept looking at him, patiently waiting for him to respond. And finally, Robert did. He said he had been traveling to Tennessee that day, so he'd been out of the state. Troutman nodded and then asked if Robert had any proof of this trip. Robert tapped on the table even louder and looked around the room some more. Then he faced Troutman and he said he'd stopped at a convenience store in a small town in Tennessee and that someone from that store might remember him. Troutman knew Robert was acting very strange and suspicious, but the detective was not ready to totally condemn the man just because of odd behavior in an interrogation room, a place where lots of people, guilty and innocent, can act very strange. Troutman knew it would take some time, but he was confident he could track down that convenience store Robert had mentioned in Tennessee and find out if anyone had seen Robert there on the day of Anna Mae's murder. And so, for the time, police would keep Robert at the top of their suspect list, but they didn't have enough evidence to actually hold him. So they told him not to leave town, but he was allowed to go. And over the next few days, while they looked into Robert's alibi, investigators tried to expand their suspect list. But even though the investigation was really just getting started, Anna Mae's family was already worried that law enforcement was not moving fast enough. On Friday, January 17th, 4 days after Anna Mae's body had been discovered, friends and family attended Anna Mae's wake, and the wake gave them all a chance to share stories about how much Anna Mae had meant to all of them. And after the wake, Anna Mae's brothers and sisters and their kids went to Earl's house. They sat together in the living room and talked about some of their favorite memories of Anna Mae. None of them could believe what had happened. And even though she had been 85 years old, they talked about how they'd always thought she would just live forever. And she had been so full of life and energy that they couldn't imagine what their family and what the town would be like without her. But as much as they wanted to focus on Anna Mae's life, they couldn't help but start to talk about the murder investigation. Many of them believed Robert Prince was the most logical suspect. But talking about Robert led to a discussion of all the other people who rented homes and properties from Anna Mae, and they started to wonder if the killer could just be anyone who might have gotten behind on rental payments. And if the list of suspects really was that long, the family worried that the local police and sheriff's department were not up to the task in front of them. And over the course of the week, no new information came in, and police still didn't have any evidence that would actually link Robert to the murder. So Anna Mae's family started to fear that maybe they had been right about the police, and they hated the idea that Anna Mae's killer was still walking free. And so some members of Anna Mae's family started to voice their opinions publicly, and soon the rest of the town joined them in putting pressure on investigators to solve this case. After all, a place that called itself the best town on earth, like Madisonville, couldn't have the brutal murder of one of its most prominent citizens just hanging over it. And things only got worse for investigators when wild rumors started to spread that there was a serial killer roaming the streets of Madisonville and that anyone could be their next victim and anyone could be the killer. Detective Troutman, Officer Rager, and the rest of the investigative team felt the tension growing in town. They'd only been working the case for about a week, but they were already getting loads of calls from residents day in and day out. Some of the calls were from people who thought they might have information that could help. But a lot of the other calls were just people demanding to know what police were doing to solve the murder and to make their town safe again. And so, as they tried to push the investigation forward and keep the town residents calm, Detective Troutman and Officer Rager both began to have a thought that they couldn't shake. They believed the extreme violence of this crime suggested the attack on Anna Mae had to have been personal, and they were almost certain that there had to be some piece of evidence connecting Anna Mae to her killer somewhere in her house. They just needed to find it. In late January, so over a week after the murder, Officer Rager returned to Anna Mae's house. The investigative team and forensics experts had searched the entire house and had combed the basement for evidence multiple times, but Rager believed there was a chance they had overlooked something in the large house. So she stepped inside, walked through the living room, and headed upstairs. And even though the house was still filled with all of Anna Mae's belongings, it felt cold and empty. On the second floor of the house, she walked down a hall towards Anna Mae's bedroom, and as she moved, the hardwood floors creaked under her feet. Then she stepped into the bedroom and went into the closet. She smiled when she saw all of Anna Mae's eccentric and luxurious clothes and shoes, but nothing else inside the closet stood out to her, so she stepped back into the bedroom and walked over to a small wooden desk in the corner. The desk had stationery, pens, and a few papers on it, but nothing that looked like it could help. Then Rager opened a desk drawer, and it was filled with loose papers and a book that looked like a journal. She pulled out the book, flipped it open, and immediately a look came across her face like she had just discovered buried treasure. This journal was a business ledger, and inside it, Anna Mae had kept detailed records of everyone who owed her money, from how much they owed and how much they had paid towards their debt. Rager knew something like this could change the course of the investigation. So she slipped the ledger into an evidence bag and then headed back downstairs and out to her car. And soon after, she met up with Detective Troutman and the rest of the investigative team, and they looked at this ledger, and they were all stunned by how many people had owed Anna Mae money. But as they looked further into the ledger, they would discover something that would bring the investigation into focus. And that discovery would soon make it clear to them who had killed Anna Mae. Based on information inside of that ledger, evidence at the crime scene, and interviews conducted during the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Anna Mae Branson in her home on Sunday, January 12, 2003. At about 7:15 p.m., Anna Mae's killer parked their pickup truck in Anna Mae's driveway, and then they sat there for a minute with the engine running. They stared out the windshield at the front door of the house and tried to tell themselves they were just there to get help, and that if Anna Mae agreed to help them, nothing bad would happen. The killer turned off the engine, reached over to the passenger seat floorboard, and grabbed the 2-foot metal braking bar that was propped up against the seat. Then they got out of the truck, hid the braking bar behind their back, and stepped onto the raised porch in front of the house. Then the killer glanced down at a large bone-handled knife tucked into a sheath on their belt. Then they took a breath and knocked on the door. Soon after, the door opened and the killer saw Anna Mae smiling back at them. The killer smiled, stepped inside, and tried to make sure Anna Mae could not see they were hiding something behind their back. Then the killer looked Anna Mae right in the eye and said they were in trouble and that she was the only one who could help them. But Anna Mae did not want to hear it, and she said she did not want to help. So the killer started yelling at her and said she had to do what they were asking, but Anna Mae started backing away and told the killer to leave. So the killer screamed that they just needed help, but Anna Mae kept shouting right back that they just needed to leave. And the killer's head started pounding, and Anna Mae's voice was making the pain worse, so the killer finally pulled out the breaker bar from behind their back and held it over their head in a threatening manner. Anna Mae saw it and screamed and turned and started rushing across the living room. The killer tried to catch their breath and stop their head from pounding. Then they grabbed the braking bar tighter and chased after Anna Mae. The killer saw her go down the hall, fling open the basement door, and close it behind her. So the killer rushed down the hall, opened up the door again, and saw Anna Mae at the bottom of the basement stairs. But the killer moved fast and caught Anna Mae as she stepped onto the rug in front of the basement couch. And once they caught her, they slammed the braking bar into the back of Anna Mae's head, and Anna Mae's body crumpled onto the rug, and blood began to run down the back of her head. Then the killer tossed the breaking bar to the floor and stood over Anna Mae. The killer couldn't believe Anna Mae had not been willing to just do what they had asked. The killer's whole body started shaking and they clenched their teeth. Then, almost unconsciously, they reached down and unsheathed the bone-handled knife on their belt, and then they crouched down above Anna Mae. The killer grabbed her by the hair and slashed the knife across her throat. Then the killer raised the knife up and began screaming and driving the knife over and over and over again into Anna Mae's back. Even though Anna Mae wasn't moving, the killer didn't stop, over and over and over. Finally, the killer stood back up, and they looked down and saw blood all over their clothes and hands and arms. In their rage, they had stabbed Anna Mae 97 times. The killer walked slowly away from Anna Mae's body over to the washer and dryer. There, they stripped off their clothes, put them in the washer, and did a load of laundry. Then they walked into the basement bathroom, started the shower, stepped in, and washed all the blood off. And after the shower, the killer put their clothes into the dryer. Then they searched the basement until they found cleaning supplies and wiped off any drops of blood they had left behind in the bathroom and on the basement floor, walls, and staircase. The killer took their time and remained calm. And when they thought they had wiped the basement clean, they walked back over to the dryer, took their clothes out, and got dressed. But for some reason, once their clothes were back on, the reality of the situation hit them. They saw Anna Mae's body lying on the floor, and all of a sudden they panicked. So the killer grabbed their weapons, stumbled up the stairs, and made their way through the house. Then they opened the front door, squinted to try to see in the dark to make sure nobody was there, and then they ran outside. The killer climbed in their truck, started the engine, threw it in reverse, and peeled out into the street. And then they put the truck in drive and floored it across town until they got home. And at 9:15 p.m., 2 hours after the killer had gone to Anna Mae's house, the killer walked back into their own home and tried to act like nothing had happened and just sat down casually on the couch. Then the killer's wife walked into the room and told him that she and the kids had really enjoyed catching up with his aunt, Anna Mae, that night at church. And the killer said, "Me too." Russell Winstead, Anna Mae's nephew, the one who had come by and been so concerned about Robert Prince and his ghosts, had been the one who murdered his aunt, the woman he said was like a second mom to him. It would turn out the ledger that investigators found in Anna Mae's house showed that over the course of the past year, Russell had borrowed tens of thousands of dollars from Anna Mae. And that information had led police to investigate Russell's finances, but they didn't just discover that Russell was in significant debt to his aunt. They discovered he was leading a full-blown double life. Unknown to any of Russell's family, including his wife, he had a severe gambling addiction and was having an affair with a casino waitress. And from Russell's financial records and interviews with that waitress, investigators found out that Russell had visited casinos in Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois 236 times in the past year, and that he had been known to lose over $30,000 on some of those visits. And when Russell's gambling losses started to affect his family and his everyday life, he had turned to his rich aunt, Anna Mae, for help. But he had told her the money he needed to borrow from her was for mining equipment. But as Russell kept coming back for more and more money, Anna Mae figured out he was lying, and she confronted him. And he admitted to her that he had lost all the money she gave him gambling. But he begged Anna Mae to please just lend him a little bit more so he could cover his mortgage payment so he and his family wouldn't lose their house. And he promised Anna Mae that he would pay her back. And then on that Friday before the murder, when Russell came over to talk to Anna Mae and they began talking about Robert Prince and the ghosts, Russell had given Anna Mae a check for $12,000 to prove that he was on his way to paying her back in full. But it turned out that Russell didn't actually have the money to cover the check he had written her. Instead, he went to a casino that night to try to win that money. But he ended up losing thousands of dollars instead. And so, on the night of January 12th, Russell drove to church separately from his wife and kids. And after the service, they all said hello to Anna Mae and caught up with her. And then Russell's wife drove home with the kids, and Russell got into his own truck and began driving around town, wondering what he was going to do. He had his braking bar that he used in the mines in the truck with him, along with his knife on his belt. And so he came up with this plan where he would ask Anna Mae to give him back the $12,000 check he'd written so she couldn't deposit it, and if she didn't give the check to him, he would threaten her with the weapons to make her do it. But things had not gone according to that plan. And when Russell arrived at his aunt's house with his breaker behind his back and his knife on his hip and demanded his aunt give him back the check that he had written her, Anna Mae said no, and she told him she was going to tell Russell's wife about his gambling problem and about all the money she had loaned him that he had lost gambling. And when Russell heard that, he flew into a blind rage, and he chased Anna Mae down into the basement and attacked her so violently that the majority of the wounds she suffered were inflicted after she was already dead. It would take months for the investigation to compile all of their evidence against Russell. But in June of 2003, over 4 months after the murder, they were ready to arrest him. But when authorities moved in on Russell's house, they discovered he had fled the country to Costa Rica, and they learned that Russell's father, Earl, was sending money he had inherited from his sister, Anna Mae, the woman Russell had murdered, to financially support Russell in Costa Rica. But with the assistance of Costa Rican authorities, U.S. federal agents were able to track Russell down, and he was arrested in Costa Rica, walking out of a casino. Russell was extradited to the United States, convicted of murder, and given 2 sentences of 25 years to life with a chance for parole in 2049. Earl would plead guilty to hindering apprehension, and he was given 2 years of probation. Anna Mae Branson is buried in Kentucky, and her family and members of the community still visit her grave often, over 20 years after her death. At 7:20 p.m. on Friday, January 12, 2007, 19-year-old college freshman Wade Steffi walked into Ford Dining Hall, which is one of 5 dining halls on Purdue University's campus. Purdue is a prestigious American university located in Indiana that is known for its excellent athletics and academics. Wade, who was an aviation technology student and was at Purdue on a full academic scholarship, grabbed some food and then sat down at a table with some friends. This was the first Friday of the 2007 spring semester, and so Wade and his friends at the table and the hundreds of other students that were sitting all around them were buzzing with excitement about what they were up to that night and what they were up to that weekend. And so Wade and his friends, they sat there chatting about their plans for about an hour, and then at around 8:20 p.m., Wade realized he needed to leave, and so he stood up, he said goodbye to his friends, he carried his tray to the trash can, and then he made his way out of the doors he came in on. And so once he was outside of the dining hall, he immediately turned right and walked the very short distance to the building that was right next to Ford Dining Hall. And so that building was called Owen Hall, and it was a dormitory. Now, this was not Wade's dormitory. He actually lived in a different dorm called Cary Quad West, which was located on the other side of Ford Dining Hall. And so Wade goes inside of Owen Hall because he has some friends in there, and he makes his way to their room, and when he goes inside, he sees they're all kind of sitting around chatting and drinking some alcoholic drinks. And so Wade sits down and he has a couple of drinks and he just hangs out with his friends for about an hour. And so around 9:30 p.m., Wade and the other people he was with in this room, they left Owen Hall and they walked the half mile away from campus to the west to this huge party at a fraternity. And so Wade would stay at this fraternity for several hours until about midnight, at which point he pulled one of his friends aside and he told them that he just remembered he had left his jacket inside of Owen Hall, and so he wanted to go back and retrieve it. The dorms on Purdue's campus all lock at night, and so the only way you can get inside is if you live there and so you have a key, or if you know someone who lives there who will open the door for you. And so during his walk back to Owen Hall, Wade would make 6 phone calls in an attempt to get someone in Owen Hall to open the door for him. But 4 of his phone calls would just be the wrong number. And so the people that were picking up and he was asking to open the door, they didn't know what he was talking about, and so they hung up. But he did call 2 people that did live inside of Owen Hall. However, they didn't answer their phones. And so around 12:30 a.m., Wade arrived at Owen Hall. He put his phone back in his pocket, and he just walked up to the doors, which were locked, and he just started knocking. And eventually, a resident of Owen Hall who didn't know Wade, and Wade didn't know them, they heard the knocking, and they came out to the door to see what was going on, and they looked through the glass, and they saw Wade, and apparently they decided that Wade looked
looked too intoxicated to let into the building, and so they refused him entry. And so Wade apparently stood there. He kept knocking for a little bit, but he eventually just kind of gave up. He turned around and he walked away. Fast forward a few days to Tuesday, January 16th, and Wade's roommate, who had actually been gone all the past weekend, he returned, and the first thing he noticed when he got back to his dorm was that Wade was not in the dorm. And so he called and texted Wade, but he didn't get a response. And so the roommate went out around the floor that they lived on to ask people if they had seen Wade, and no one had seen him since the previous Friday. And so starting to get pretty concerned, the roommate called Wade's family to see if maybe they knew what was going on with him, but his family had no idea. And so by the end of that day, the police had been contacted about Wade potentially being missing, and they in turn contacted Wade's cell phone provider, and they were able to determine that Wade's cell phone was still showing up somewhere on Purdue's campus, although they couldn't figure out exactly where. So that evening, a massive campus-wide search was launched with hundreds of police officers and volunteers. Even the school's equestrian club came out with their horses to search the nearby woods. But despite this huge search effort that would go on for several weeks, the only thing they would find of Wade's was one of his shoes. It was found on January 20th, so just 4 days into the search, and it was located right outside of an exterior door that led into a maintenance room inside of Owen Hall. But when they searched this maintenance room, Wade wasn't in there. Finally, after nearly a month of searching, when they still had not found Wade, the official search was called off. On March 19th, roughly 2 months after Wade had been reported missing, a maintenance worker was downstairs in the laundry room of Owen Hall when they heard a strange popping sound. At first, the worker thought it was actually coming from one of the washers or dryers that was on, and maybe there's a loose coin or some piece of metal that was inside of the washer or dryer that's getting banged around inside, and that's making the sound. And so this worker began walking around the laundry room, kind of listening in to each of the washers and dryers that were on to see if they were making this sound. And so as he's doing this, he hears the popping sound again, but it's clearly not coming from any of the washers and dryers. In fact, it's not even coming from inside the laundry room. It's coming from somewhere out in the hall. Curious, he leaves the laundry room and he goes out into the hall, and as soon as he's standing in the hall, he hears the popping sound again. And this time it was obvious that it was coming from behind the closed door that was directly opposite the laundry room. So the worker pulled out his big set of keys, he opened the door that was directly in front of him, and he stepped inside. Moments later, he would make a big discovery. Based on that discovery and the investigation that would follow it, this is a reconstruction of what happened to Wade Steffi. In the early morning hours of January 13th, right after Wade had been denied entry into Owen Hall because the student who was in there who didn't know him thought he was too intoxicated, right after that happened, Wade left the front doors and made his way around to the left side of the building to look for another way inside. And when he got to the left side of the building, he found another door. Now, even though this door did not have a sign on it that said "keep out," it was fairly obvious that this door was not designed for students to use. There was a metal railing that lined the outside of this door, clearly to prevent pedestrians from getting to the door, and the door itself was actually not built at ground level. It basically was built at basement level, so you'd be standing at this railing looking down at the door, and down in front of the door was a slab of cement right out in front of it that gave the door enough clearance to be able to open. And so basically there was a railing around a pit, and that was where the door was. The proper way to get to this door was to literally climb over that railing and jump down into this pit. And then you'd need a key to open this door because it was always locked. Well, it was supposed to always be locked. And so when Wade saw this clearly off-limits door on the side of Owen Hall, in his drunken state, he decided it would be a good idea to try to go into it, because in his mind, he thought, whatever is behind this door doesn't really matter. As long as I can just get inside of some part of Owen Hall, I can find my way up to my friend's room and I can get my jacket. And so he rushes over to the railing, he climbs over, he leaps down into that pit area, He grabs the doorknob of this off-limits door and he pulls on it, and it's open. So he opens it up, he steps inside, and it's totally pitch black. And all he can hear is the sound of machines humming and whirring in the darkness. And again, in his drunken state, he decides this is still a good idea. His only concern was he couldn't find a light switch, and it really was basically pitch black in here. And he was worried once the door shut, not only would his only light source be totally cut off, but it might actually lock behind him, and then he'd be trapped inside of this room. And so he took off one of his shoes and he tucked it in the door jamb of the door he came in on to keep it open. And so with the door propped open behind him, he began walking into this room. And pretty much right away, he bumped into this big metal structure. He couldn't see what it was because, again, it was too dark, but he could feel it and he could tell, it was a flat metal structure. It felt like a machine of some kind, and he could hear that it was one of the machines that was buzzing and whirring. And so he just decided he would try to walk around it. Because again, his goal is just to get through this room and find another door somewhere and kind of continue his journey up into the dorm. And so Wade began moving his way left along this machine, kind of believing it was going to come to a stop at some point, and then he could walk around it. But it would turn out this machine was very big, very wide. And so by the time he actually got to the left edge of this machine, he was practically right up against the wall of the room he was in. And when he got there, he realized the space between the side of the machine and the wall of the room was big enough that if he turned sideways, he could basically squeeze his way past it. Now, he had no idea how far into the room this strange machine went, but in his drunken state, he decided it was a good idea. And so he turns sideways, so his back is to the wall of the room, and his chest is going to be facing the machine, and he begins pushing himself into that narrow space. And so as he's making his way, his hands are up, kind of protecting his face and neck, and at some point, he kind of begins to trip. Now, he didn't actually fall because he's basically wedged into this tight space, but for a second, he reflexively grabbed with his hands onto this machine right in front of him, and just by chance, his left ring finger slipped into a very narrow hole that was about 2 inches deep. The room that Wade was inside of was called an electrical vault, and it contained 6 large transformers, one of which Wade's finger had just stuck inside of. The job of these 6 transformers is to take the high voltage they receive from the main power grid and then transform it, hence the name, into lower, usable voltage that gets dispersed into Owen Hall for residents and teachers. Even though the outside of these transformers had mostly been covered with protective materials that mitigated the electrocution risk, there were still several parts of these machines that there was just nothing you could do. They just presented a really high electrocution risk. And one of those sections you needed to be extra careful with was that 2-inch hole that Wade's finger slipped inside of. At the back of that hole was an exposed electrical conductor, and the second the tip of his finger touched that conductor, between 2,000 and 4,000 volts of electricity were pumped into his body. For reference, when people get executed via the electric chair, they are electrocuted with 2,000 volts of electricity. Wade likely died instantly. But because of the fact that he was kind of wedged between the transformer and the wall, after he died, he didn't just slump onto the ground. Instead, he remained in a semi-upright position with his finger still stuck inside of that hole. And so for the next 2 months, his body just continued to be electrocuted every second. Finally, sometime in March, as a result of Wade's body fluids draining out of him, the electrical current that was being pumped into him altered its course and began snapping outside of his skin into the ground. And so the sound of the electrical current actually striking the ground was that popping sound that the maintenance worker heard. The door that the maintenance worker opened in order to investigate the sound was the only other door that led into the electrical vault, the other being the exterior door that Wade had gone in on. Initially, when the worker opened that door and looked inside of the vault, he actually didn't see Wade, But he smelled something funny, and that was what led him to walk into the room and make his way around, and that's when he spotted Wade's body. Earlier, on January 20th, when they found Wade's shoe, which at some point had just slipped out of the door jamb, so it was not propping open the exterior door when it was found, it was just sitting in that pit area, and the exterior door was shut. And so when they found that shoe, the police, they did go inside of the electrical vault, but they didn't go in through the exterior door. They went around and went in the same door that the maintenance worker opened from right across the hall from the laundry room. And when they opened it up, they just looked into the room. They didn't walk into the room, they just looked from the doorway, and from their perspective, they couldn't see Wade. And so that was why initially they had said, Wade is not inside of that room. Ultimately, because that exterior door to the electrical vault was supposed to be locked at all times, and clearly it was not because that's how Wade got in, Purdue was found to be negligent, and so they agreed to pay Wade's family $500,000, and they also set up a scholarship in Wade's name. Before we get into our next story, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. When I first sought out therapy to try to deal with some of my mental health issues, I remember feeling really nervous about that first interaction with the therapist. The idea of sitting in this room and pouring my heart out to this person I barely knew seemed really stressful and almost made me not want to go through with it. Now, I'm glad that I did go through with it because therapy has been an extremely important and positive thing in my life, but I wish there had just been an option to take a phone call with my therapist to kick off the relationship. Well, with BetterHelp, that is an option because BetterHelp is an online therapy platform that offers secure phone call sessions as well as video sessions, and they have a great chat feature that allows you to message your therapist at any time. So far, the people from our strange, dark, and mysterious community who have given BetterHelp a shot have been very pleased with their experience. BetterHelp is very easy to sign up for and use. You just fill out this questionnaire that helps assess your specific needs, and then within 48 hours, you're paired up with a therapist. Then you begin to schedule your sessions with or without video. If at any time you want to change your therapist, it is free and easy to do so. So if you're struggling right now with your mental health, but you've held off starting therapy because maybe you are intimidated about starting the process, then I would highly encourage you to make BetterHelp your starting point. And you get 10% off your first month if you go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen. Again, that's betterhelp.com/MrBallen. Okay, back to the stories. During the California Gold Rush of 1848, hundreds of thousands of Americans living on the east coast of the United States packed up their things in covered wagons and headed west for California to attempt to, quite literally, strike gold. About a year after the rush started, so in the winter of 1849, a group of about 100 would-be gold prospectors were on their way across the continental United States to California when they got lost in this totally barren stretch of desert, roughly 500 miles from their destination, which was San Francisco. They would spend the next 2 months driving around this desert looking for a way out, but they wouldn't find it, and so finally they just stopped, set up camp, and waited to die. But as a last-ditch effort, they sent ahead 2 of their fittest men to try to go out and find help. And miraculously, those 2 men would find help, and it wasn't long before the lost pioneers were going up and over this mountain pass out of the desert out to safety. And so as the pioneers are cresting this mountain, one of the pioneers turns and looks down at the desert valley below where they almost all died, and he famously said, "Goodbye, Death Valley," and the name stuck. While Death Valley has since become a very popular tourist destination for adventurous people, it is still truly one of the harshest environments on the planet. In addition to just being a big open desert, which presents a whole host of problems to any mammal, Death Valley also becomes one of the hottest places on the planet every summer. The temperatures soar to 120 degrees Fahrenheit and sometimes get as high as 136 degrees Fahrenheit. It's the kind of place where if you don't respect it, it will kill you. In 2005, a 35-year-old man named Robert Dahmer, who lived in Los Angeles, California, decided he wanted to take a trip into Death Valley. Specifically, he wanted to go to the hot springs located in the northwest corner of Death Valley, and actually there's a nudist resort that is right around those hot springs. And so Robert wanted to go check that whole scene out. And so on July 26th of that year, Robert left Los Angeles in his Volkswagen van, and he drove north about 4 hours until he got to Bishop, California, which is a small town where some of his family lived. After spending the night with them, the next morning when Robert got up, he got back into his van and he drove south about 20 minutes to a town called Zurich, California, where he picked up Death Valley Road. This road covers the entirety of Death Valley, starting from its northern entrance, where Robert was, all the way south 140 miles to its southern entrance. And this road is actually basically a straight line. But off of this very straight road are literally hundreds of miles of unpaved roads that splinter off in all directions across the desert. And these roads bring people to other points of interest, like, for example, the nudist resort that Robert wanted to go to. So after Robert hopped onto the Death Valley Road at its northern entrance, he began driving south for about an hour, and then he began looking for the turnoff to the unpaved road that would take him the last 50 miles to the nudist resort. And so eventually, Robert believes he's found this turnoff, and so he gets onto this unpaved road and he starts driving for a while, and then all of a sudden his car just sinks down into the ground and it won't budge. It would turn out Robert had made a mistake. He had not turned onto the correct unpaved road. Instead, he had picked a road that led right out onto this salt flat, and so to the naked eye it would have looked like the ground in front of him was totally flat and hard packed and you could easily walk on or drive on it. But in reality, the surface of the salt flat is very brittle, and underneath that brittle surface is this thick section of mud. And so before Robert could realize his mistake, he had broken through the surface layer of the salt flat and got stuck in that mud. After trying unsuccessfully to get his van back out again, Robert realized he was in a really bad situation. His cell phone had no reception, so he couldn't contact anyone, and he was too far away to attempt to walk to the nearest civilization to try to get help. But luckily, he had packed lots and lots of water that was in his van, and so he decided the only thing he could do was just sit tight at his van, ration out his water, and wait for someone on Death Valley Road to look out and see him and come to his rescue. But after waiting for 6 days, no one saw him. And now his water supply was dwindling, and so Robert decided his only option was to abandon his van and make the walk to civilization. And so he packed up all the water he could, he threw it on his back, and he began to walk. And just like the lost pioneers of 1849, at the very last second, Robert was rescued. As he stumbled across the desert, his canteen empty, this group of teenage boys and a few adults who were part of this group called the League of Venturers were out in Death Valley doing search and rescue training. And so they literally turned onto the same road that Robert accidentally turned onto and then got stuck on. And so they came down and found Robert. And Robert, when he saw them, he was hysterical. He was crying tears of joy. He really believed he was going to die probably that day. And so the League of Venturers, they take Robert into their van and they drive him 80 miles to the nearest ranger station. And as soon as Robert got out of the car, he dropped to his knees and he kissed the ground in appreciation. I mean, this guy really was that close to death. That evening, Robert would hitch a ride from the ranger station back to Bishop, California. And the next morning, Robert spoke with a local towing company and they agreed to drive him out into Death Valley to locate his van and tow it back out again. But when they got out there and they found his van, the towing company saw that the van was not in good shape. It had 2 flat tires and there were several other mechanical issues with it. And they told Robert, look, we can't tow it out until the repairs are made, and we can't make those repairs right now. And so they left the van where it was and they drove Robert back to Bishop. And then when they got there, Robert, who was quite handy with his van, decided he would just make the repairs himself. And so he went around town, he gathered up all the supplies he would need, and then that evening, he got a local young couple to give him a ride back into Death Valley. Robert had told his family right before he left that his plan was to go and fix his van and then that night come back to Bishop, and then the next day he would contact the towing company again and they could come out and they could get his van out. But that night, Robert did not come back to Bishop, and the next morning, when his family still had not heard from him or seen him, they contacted authorities. It would take a few days, but the authorities would eventually figure out what happened to Robert. The young couple that gave Robert a ride back into Death Valley, they dropped him off at this intersection right off of Death Valley Road, where they and Robert believed was only about a mile away from that nudist resort that Robert had originally wanted to go to. Robert had told the couple that his plan was just to walk from that point. He would go to that resort and he would recruit somebody else to drive him the rest of the way to the van. He could make the repairs and that person would drive him back and that would be it. So Robert got out. He said thank you to the couple and he waved to them as they drove off. And then he stashed his van supplies and then turned away from Death Valley Road and began walking along this unpaved road into the desert. However, unbeknownst to Robert or to the couple, the spot he was dropped off was the wrong spot. He was not a mile or less away from this resort. He was about 15 miles away from this resort, and the path was fairly circuitous, so even if he knew the distance, he likely would not have been able to even navigate his way there. And so after wandering down this unpaved road for about 10 miles, Robert left the unpaved road and began heading out into open desert, likely seeking water. Robert would eventually collapse and die just 4 days after he had been rescued from the exact same situation. When his body was found, he didn't have a GPS or a map or even a container for water. In late 2002, 25-year-old Jason Chase worked as a sheep shearer in an area called Gisborne, which is located in the northeastern section of New Zealand. When Jason wasn't working, he was often on his bike, cycling up and down the coast, preparing for his next road race. In early December of that year, Jason contacted his family, who lived in a small town called Dannevirke, which is located about 200 miles southwest of Gisborne, and he told them that he wanted to come visit them for Christmas. However, he didn't know exactly when he would actually arrive at their house because his training and work schedule were fairly hectic, but he told them, "Don't worry, I will be there at least on Christmas Day, December 25th, or a couple of days earlier." His family was thrilled and they said, "No problem, we can't wait to see you whenever that is." And so by the time mid-December rolled around and Jason still had not arrived at his family's home in Dannevirke, his family wasn't concerned at all. However, that would soon change. On December 13th, a hunter was driving along the many winding back roads of the Ruahine mountain range. This mountain range, which is located about 8 miles north of Dannevirke, is a very isolated and rugged wilderness area that's full of steep gorges and gullies and very thick brush. And so as this hunter rounds the turn on this road, he looks up ahead and he sees there's a car parked on the side of the road. And so this hunter pulls up right alongside this car and he looks over and he can tell, there's no one inside of it. There's no obvious damage to the car. And then the hunter began kind of scanning around the area to see if there was some obvious reason someone would stop right at that particular spot. But when he looked around, all he saw was thick trees on either side, and the mountain kind of sloped down on either side. And so there was nothing unique about the spot. And so something just kind of struck the hunter as odd about this car. It just seemed totally out of place. And so operating on a hunch, the hunter would leave the mountain range and head into Dannevirke, and he would contact police and he would tell them about this car and where it was located, because in the hunter's mind, maybe someone had been reported missing in the area and maybe this car is connected. And so after hearing about the car, the police did not know of any missing person cases that were connected to a car that matched the description the hunter had given. But just to be safe, the police hopped in their vehicles and they drove up into the Ruahine mountain range and they went to the spot the hunter described. And sure enough, off to the side of the road is this parked car and it's still unoccupied. After inspecting the vehicle, the police came to the same conclusion the hunter did, that there was no obvious signs of damage to the car that might have forced someone to abandon it. And then when they looked in the window at the gas gauge, they saw the gauge was full. And so the police kind of wandered around the area, kind of doing an initial search to see if maybe the owner of this car was nearby. But, there was no one there. They're in this very isolated part of this wilderness area. And so the police just took down the license plate of the car and they went back to their station. And when they got there, they ran the license plate number and it turned out the car belonged to Jason Chase. When Jason's family was contacted about, why is where's Jason's car up in the Ruahine Mountains? Where's Jason? His family was pretty surprised. They explained to police that Jason had made plans to come visit them around Christmas time, and so they were expecting him to come this way. And the Ruahine mountain range, it is only 8 miles away from Dannevirke, so in theory, maybe he stopped there on the way to their house, but they told police that just didn't make any sense. So as a precaution, the police decided to launch a search for Jason. And unfortunately, despite hundreds of people on the ground searching the Ruahine mountain range and helicopters overhead flying all over the place, no trace of Jason was found. And so the official search was called off right before Christmas, but Jason's family and friends, they continued to look for him. And on January 3rd, they would find him. One of the family friends who had agreed to continue looking for Jason after the official search had shut down was a farmer who owned a plane. And on January 3rd, as he did one of his passes over the foothills of the Ruahine mountain range, he looked down and he saw this bright red thing that looked totally out of place. And the pilot couldn't tell what it was, and so he took note of its location. And then when he landed, he passed those coordinates off to the ground team. And so the ground team, they made their way over to this location, which was quite far away from where Jason's car had been. And after making their way through some very thick brush and some very steep sections, they eventually walked out to this big open clearing. It was a dry riverbed, and right in front of them, in the middle of it, was the bright red thing. It was Jason's shirt, and Jason was still wearing it. He was found lying on his left side with his legs stretched out. He had on his bright red rugby t-shirt, some khaki shorts on, and he had no shoes or socks on. According to the searchers who first saw Jason in this dry creek bed, they would say the scene was very peaceful, and it almost looked like Jason had lied down to fall asleep. But Jason was not sleeping, he was dead. Jason had no visible injuries, and there was no sign of a struggle in the area. In fact, it didn't even look like Jason had been in the wild for very long because his clothes were pristine, and despite being barefoot, his feet were in great condition. Despite a lengthy search around the area where his body was discovered, his shoes and socks would not be recovered. The only thing they found in the area was a water bottle that belonged to Jason. Adding to the mystery of what happened to Jason were the results of his autopsy. The pathologist was unable to find any injuries. Jason also seemed well nourished because he had food in his stomach, and he was hydrated because there was urine in his bladder. His toxicology report also came back negative for all drugs, medications, and a range of common poisons. The only odd thing the pathologist found during the autopsy was that Jason had 2 very small ulcers in his duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. According to this pathologist, these type of ulcers only appear from acute stress moments before death. However, these ulcers don't indicate what caused the stress. Typically, things like severe injury or septicemia, which is blood poisoning, will cause these stress ulcers. But Jason had neither of those. So at the end of the autopsy, the pathologist concluded that Jason had not been the victim of a homicide, he had not committed suicide, he had died from, quote, obscure natural causes. Interestingly though, the pathologist was able to determine with some certainty that Jason died on or around December 30th. Which means he was alive for the entirety of the official search for him, as well as the bulk of that private search conducted by friends and family. After the autopsy results came out, Jason's case was closed, and his family, despite having lots of unanswered questions, was forced to just move on. 15 years later, the same pathologist that had conducted Jason's autopsy was talking to a colleague about Jason's case. And as he was describing where Jason was found, the colleague suddenly stopped the pathologist and said, "Wait a minute, I think I know what happened to him." And it would turn out he did. The following is a reconstruction of what happened to Jason Chase. On December 13th, 2002, Jason left his home in Gisborne and began heading south towards Dannevirke, where his family lived. But before he got to his family's home, he took a detour up into the Ruahine mountain range, where he eventually parked his car on the side of the road. Once his car was stopped, he got out and collected his backpack and sleeping bag. Those were 2 items that were never discovered during the search or after his body was found, but it was later determined they were missing from his vehicle. And so after he has his pack and his sleeping bag, he also grabs a water bottle, and then he leaves the main road and begins walking into the woods, making his way down the mountain. He eventually would find a spot on the side of the mountain that he liked, and so he set up a campsite. What happens next is very confusing because we don't actually know why Jason actually went camping in the first place or when he intended to leave, but we can make one assumption. Whatever he was doing in the mountains, he planned on wrapping it up in time to still get to his family's house in Dannevirke on or before Christmas Day, December 25th. So from December 13th, when he first got out of his car and entered the wilderness, until December 25th, it's believed Jason was, by choice, out in the wilderness of the Ruahine mountain range. And so as this huge search is launched for him in the area he is in, it's entirely possible that he either did not see any of the searchers. This is a very rugged and heavily forested area, and so that's not totally outlandish. Or two, even if he did see the searchers, he may not have recognized that they were looking for him because remember, during that time frame, he didn't think he was in danger. He was out in the wilderness camping by choice. But sometime around December 25th, or maybe a couple of days before, when he needed to leave and go back to Dannevirke to see his family, after packing up his stuff, for whatever reason, he could not get back up to the road where his car was. Either there was some sort of physical boundary, or maybe he got lost. But either way, instead of going back up the mountain, we know Jason actually turned and began going down the mountain, away from the road and away from his car. It's believed Jason actually just decided he would hike his way out of the mountains. He was in great shape, very healthy guy, and he probably figured he could just hike the 8 miles to Dannevirke, and then he could have someone drive him back up and retrieve his car at a later date. But on or around December 30th, Jason was still out in the mountains. And at this point, he had abandoned his backpack and his sleeping bag and had most likely removed his shoes and socks for reasons we don't know. But he had managed to get much closer to Dannevirke. He just had to navigate a few more steep sections and then he'd be home free. And so on or around December 30th, Jason began slowly making his way down the mountainside until he reached a decision point. He found himself standing at the top of 2 very steep gullies that both would bring him down to a dry stretch of riverbed, and so either option worked. It just became a matter of which one is safer. And so after making his assessment about which gully he should take, he made his choice and he made his way down and he reached the dry riverbed. And it was at this point that Jason would have begun to feel a pain in his stomach. And that pain would have gotten worse and worse and worse to the point where Jason likely sat down on this dry riverbed, kind of waiting for the pain to subside, but it wouldn't. It would only intensify. And so as he's sitting there kind of wondering what's going on, his vision would begin to blur, and then he would start to struggle breathing. And before he could deal with all of these strange symptoms that were coming on really suddenly, he lost the ability to move his body and he slumped over onto his left side, and there he would lay until he died. It would turn out the gully that Jason had chosen to go down when he was standing at the top and he had those 2 choices, the one he chose, that one contained a plant called Urtica ferox. This plant, which is endemic to New Zealand, grows leaves that are covered in little rigid stinging hairs that contain a toxin called trifidin. And trifidin, in high enough doses, not only causes stomach pain and blurred vision and trouble breathing, but it also causes total body paralysis and even death. Jason, who according to friends would have known about the dangers this plant posed, likely just didn't see the cluster of plants when he was assessing which gully to go down. And so it wasn't until he was partway down the gully and was in these plants that he realized his mistake. But when he turned to go back up, it was just too steep. And so he was forced to trudge through these toxic plants. And because he was wearing shorts, his lower legs were exposed and they were stung repeatedly. And so he was dealt a lethal dose. The reason the pathologist was not able to identify this as Jason's cause of death is because the stingers on those plants, they don't leave any marks on the human body. And its poison, trifidin, is so rare that when they sent out that toxicology report, they didn't include it. They did not test for trifidin. And so it wasn't until 15 years later when the pathologist's colleague heard that Jason had been found in the Ruahine Mountains that the colleague said, wait a minute, have you checked for for Trifidin because he knew the Ruahine Mountains were home to clusters of that toxic plant. And so sure enough, they went back to where Jason's body had been found, and lining the gully that he had come down were dozens and dozens